Washington Journal continues.
And we continue today with our ongoing Spotlight on Magazine series featuring a recent edition of Reason magazine. And inside that is this piece, The High Price of Security Theater, the $4 trillion war on terror. Where did the money go? Jim Bovard joining us, a contributor to Reason magazine, to talk about this piece that he wrote. All right, let's begin with this $4 trillion price tag first. How'd you come up with that number?
Well, this is the total cost of the homeland security, the war on terrorism at home, and the cost of our wars abroad. In the last 15 years, the U.S. government has seized far more power. It's killed a huge number of people, but killing foreigners is not a recipe for keeping Americans safe. And it's unfortunate the entire political culture in this country has changed. People became far more deferential to Washington, and it was almost as if people had to maintain faith that the government is keeping us safe or else we'll all be killed. The government has been able to be far more secretive. The government has, both the Bush and the Obama administration have acted like the constitutional law does not apply. And part of the result is just a torrent of government spending, most of which is wasteful, and some of which has directly destroyed our freedoms.
There hasn't been another 9/11, 2001 terrorist attack since 2001, so is it money well spent?
There was not a major attack like that before 9/11, so, I mean, simply because there hasn't been another massive attack doesn't prove that all the stuff the government is doing is justified. Because if a lot of people tend to look at the war on terror with a broad brush overview. But what I try to do in this article is walk through the details, walk through the absurdities, walk through some of the details, like, for instance, the Homeland Security is financing fusion centers around the country, which are creating these databases of suspicious activity. And, for instance, out in Los Angeles, there's a database that was keeping track of people that were hanging around talking on their cell phone too long, or joggers who were hanging out. There's other databases that have targeted gun owners, or libertarian types, or people that are anti-immigration. And you have these huge garbage bins, federal garbage bins, which all these different agencies are tossing in unverified information. It's building up millions of dossiers on Americans, and this information can and will be used against people. And so it's not simply a laughable boondoggle, but these are programs which are deadly perils to our liberty.
And $1 billion since 2001 spent on these fusion centers.
Well, Senator Coburn had a great report on this, and he asked some simple questions of the Homeland Security. Well, how much did you spend? We don't know. I mean, the Homeland Security gave him estimates that varied 400%. It's like, okay, this is not a difficult question. And not only that, but the feds cannot even say how many different fusion centers that there were. At one point they were saying 71, 72, well, it's 77. Where are the others? They're secret. I mean, it's amazing how much secrecy the government has gotten away with in the last 15 years, when so many times the veil of secrecy simply covered official lies. We saw that with the invasion of Iraq. We've seen that with the Obama's drone program. We've seen that with some of the shifting rationales for our bombing of Libya. And yet, folks don't realize that if the government's allowed to keep secrets and lie to them, then self-government is a charade.
The biggest price tag that you note in your piece is the war spending, $3 trillion. So of this $4 trillion that's been spent, $3 trillion has been on these wars. Explain.
Yeah, the most expensive single issues have been the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And the war in Iraq was justified as a response to 9/11. The Bush administration sought to make people worked very hard to give the impression that Saddam had a link to 9/11, even though it knew it was false. 3 or 4 years after the invasion, they backed off of that. For a while, they said they were bringing democracy to Iraq. That hasn't worked so well. They've also said that they're trying to get better treatment for women. That hasn't worked very well either. Same thing in Afghanistan. I mean, it's understandable the U.S. would have gone after the Taliban after the Afghanistan had been used as a base for the 9/11 attacks. But there was no need to occupy the country, and we have spent vast amounts of money and thousands of American soldiers' lives in this charade of making Afghanistan a democracy. And they've had 2 major presidential elections. both of which were decided by massive fraud, which the U.S. government admitted, and then say, well, but the government's, it's still kind of legitimate, so we'll keep propping it up. American soldiers have died for nothing in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The war on terror. The cost, according to Reason Magazine and Jim Bovard, $4 trillion since 2001. We're taking your comments and your questions on that this morning. Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. Start dialing in. Also, one of the other big price tags is the FBI, $30 billion. What was that money for? Where has it gone?
Well, the FBI has got a huge increase in its budget, even though the FBI screw-ups were a major reason the 9/11 hijackers succeeded. I mean, there was a huge effort to sweep the federal failures under the rug after 9/11, but the CIA and the FBI failed massively as far as keeping track of the people that apparently carried out the 9/11 attacks. There were so many warning signs, but the feds were simply incompetent. And yet, in spite of being incompetent, they've gotten huge increases in their budget. The one thing the FBI has done, it's been massively engaged in entrapment. They've been setting up people all over the country. There are some people who are actually dangerous, but what the FBI has often done is just find nitwits and persuade them to kind of, do some babble about Islam. And a number of times the FBI has given them mock bombs or fake things and then busted them. And, it works out great for the FBI. They have 2 or 3 days of great headlines and everybody's saying, thank God that they keep us safe. A week or 2 weeks or a month later, the details come out and it looks brazen entrapment. You had the case down in Liberty City, Miami. We had 5 or 6 guys who were, roped into this by an FBI informant. And those guys were so dumb that they asked the FBI guy for terrorist uniforms. Okay, we don't need protection against would-be terrorists who ask for uniforms, okay? But this is the kind of thing that works out great for the FBI, for their PR and their budget. And, and unfortunately, most people in Congress have been utterly servile, both on the FBI and on most other federal agencies. Congress is supposed to do vigorous oversight. They haven't. Most of them have just lined up to polish federal boots in the war on terror.
You note in your story, Trevor Aronson, author of The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism, he estimates that only about 1% of the 500 people charged with international terrorism offenses in the decade after 9/11 were bona fide threats.
Yeah, and his book is one of the best analyses, one of the most thorough breakdowns of that. And here's another thing. Okay, so if a lot of the trouble with the war on terror is the definition of terrorism, because it's very vague and it's also very it works out well for the government. Because if some American sends $100 to some of these groups in Syria that have been classified as terrorists, that American could be sent to prison for 5 years for material support for terrorism. But if the U.S. government decides to send the same group a bunch of weaponry, well, that's not a problem. Our policy in Syria epitomizes the irrationality and just the mindlessness of the war on terror. LA Times reported a month or two ago that in Syria right now there are CIA-backed rebels fighting Pentagon-backed rebels. Okay, do we really need to have this, U.S. government has gotten in the habit of intervening so often on every side of the issue that these kind of absurdities occur. But because it was in the LA Times and not the Washington Post, people in Washington say, I didn't hear about that. But most, we have a trouble with attention deficit democracy on Capitol Hill as well, because most of the congressmen are very poorly informed about the war on terror, as well as being servile.
We'll get to calls here. Kim is up first in Santa Cruz, California. Independent caller. Hi, Kim.
Hi. I'm very concerned that the Constitution is not being, not being held up. When they go and do an assassination on Osama bin Laden, who is actually, what did Seymour Hersh say, was actually just sitting there, prisoner of war. How I feel like our Congress is criminal. Why wasn't Bush ever put in jail, Cheney put in jail? I don't understand any of this.
Well, it's a really good point about the Constitution. It's very frustrating to me because I was raised and told that America was the nation that obeys the law and that we have rule of law in this country. But for the war on terror, it's almost nothing but sovereign immunity, meaning that the government can do whatever it wants and the government is never prosecuted. As far as the Constitution, the Eighth Amendment prohibits torture. And as well as federal law prohibited torture. Yet you had, starting in 2002, the Bush administration embraced that. And then the Obama came into office and he chose not to prosecute the people that were involved in torture, except for the one CIA guy, John Carrico, who blew the whistle on the torture. He was the only CIA official prosecuted for torture, even though he was a hero. And the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures, that has been completely shredded in the war on terror. If you look at what Edward Snowden courageously brought out, why have there not been any indictments on that? But instead, you have a reaction in Washington where they circle the wagons. It doesn't matter what laws were violated. It doesn't matter how many Americans' rights have been trampled or shredded. The government still is sacrosanct.
Bill, in New Mexico, a Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning to both of you. Greta, you need to have an interview with Morgan Reynolds. He was the top economist under the Bush administration, George Bush administration. He is now a professor at A&M in Texas University. You and James both need to interview this individual.
I know Morgan.
Yes, and discuss his book. And thank you for your time and effort, James.
Well, thank you, sir.
Well, tell us about who he's talking about and how do you know him?
Morgan Reynolds has done some very good work on government interventions, on government waste. He's very free market oriented. He's very skeptical of the official story on 9/11. I am not so skeptical of that. I think it was basically a vast number of government screw-ups, which the government does well. One of the few things the government does well, but it's frustrating to me to see. It's understandable to me that a lot of people would think that 9/11 was a conspiracy because the government has changed its story so many times. But that doesn't prove the government did it. And if you look at the 9/11 Commission, for instance, when their report came out in the summer of 2004, which was very timely for Bush's re-election campaign, it basically avoided finding fault with the government. Instead, had all these broad, vague things. That turned out a lot of the 9/11 Commission information came from torture. That the 9/11 commissioners were actually sending requests to the CIA to find out more information about this and that. And so many of the details which they provided in their official storyline of the 9/11 attacks came from torture of some of the suspects. Philip Shannon of the New York Times has done some excellent work on that. It's not just me. You have that look in your face, kind of like, uh-oh, where's he going with this?
No,
Where's he going?
No, not at all. Not at all. Finish your thought, though.
No, I was just saying it's typical of how official history is written in D.C. that you have this panel, this bipartisan panel, the 9/11 Commission, which was put on the pedestal, which largely absolved the government and it relied on torture. And, that fact comes out 3 or 4 years later and people say, but this is how history is written in D.C.
What I wanted to add to the conversation is this whole debate over the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report, because Senator Rand Paul wants to add an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Bill that the Senate's debating and voting on this week that would release those 28 pages.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of that. I wrote a story for USA Today last July on this. There's a group called 28pages.org that does great work, that's really helped propel this issue. It makes no sense for the U.S. to be covering up these key materials, this key information on what happened on 9/11, especially when it appears that the Saudi government that people in the Saudi government may have been financing some of the people that carried out the 9/11 attacks. 15 of the 19 people reported as hijackers were Saudis. And yet you had the Bush administration, you had others just very anxious to sweep this under the rug. Senator Bob Graham of Florida, former senator, has done great work on this issue.
We are talking about James Bovard's piece in Reason magazine, the recent edition of it. The title, The High Price of Security Theater, the $4 trillion War on Terror. Where did the money go? Martina, North Andover, Massachusetts Republican, you're next.
Yes, I'm actually independent, but I'm speaking, I'd like to speak to the issue of the sale of arms, being big business, big profit. It ties into the issue of war, the fear-based culture, that we live in, President Obama's visit to Vietnam, lifting the arms embargo for sale of arms. So, my question would be, why are we going around the world selling arms, adding to the mayhem, big arms sales, big bucks, big mayhem? You know, on the most basic level, when a child hits a friend with a bat, do we give him another bat? No, we take a bat away. And I think James is a voice of reason, and I think many of us need to get on board with practicalities, common sense. Why are we arming up all of these people, or all of these, whatever you want to call them, and wondering about what happens after the fact?
Thanks for your comment. Thanks for the excellent question. It's a good point about how all these sales, the arms sales, and I think there's a lot of parallels if you look at who's donated to the Clinton Foundation and there's been a big increase, I think, in the approvals for arms sales since Obama took office, especially when Hillary Clinton was was Secretary of State. And there was an article in Mother Jones, I think, recently that broke down some of the parallels between a lot of the big military contractors have donated to the Clinton Foundation, and they've done very well under this. The article, the comment on the fear-based culture, we have that in this country as well, because basically what we have is an awful lot of fear-mongering. There's been a profound change in American politics the last 15 years, and it's made much easier for the government to push the fear alarm and make a lot of people a lot more docile. I mean, you see that with TSA. You see folks willing to do anything. I mean, they would bend over and squeal if TSA said so. I mean, it's amazing to see how the government's become so much more intrusive. And I've written a lot about TSA. The TSA chief publicly condemned my work a couple years ago. I was hurt deeply. But it's interesting to chat folks up in the TSA line and see, well, what do you think of this? A lot of them are kind of saying, hey, this is a bunch of crap, but others are saying, I'm glad that they're keeping me safe. And I'm thinking like, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn I'll sell you. But politicians have sold that bridge to Brooklyn, to American people, and that's why our federal debt has skyrocketed. So.
Well, the Congress will hear from the TSA administrator today up on Capitol Hill to testify about what's going on with those long airport security lines. That's at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN 3 this morning. And you write about the TSA in this piece that we're talking about and how much money has gone to them since 2001. $70 billion for the TSA. TSA behavior detection officers, another billion. TSA time wasting, you calculated that at $8 billion, so we'll talk about that.
Yeah, that's low.
Okay, so
tell
us about time wasting by TSA.
Yeah, I mean, basically people need to get to the airport earlier than what they would have in the pre-9/11 era. Maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. I mean, crap, TSA is telling people now to get to the airport 3 hours early. You got a place in Chicago, and they get there that early, and they're just stretched out forever. And that's a real cost, and that's something that really changes. You mentioned the behavior detection. TSA has thousands of behavior detection officers who are kind of wandering around airports, and they're looking for micro signs, microaggressions, whatever, people's faces that would give away the fact that they have terrorist intent. Now, for instance, if someone is yawning or someone seems nervous or they're sweaty, that's a sign that you might be a terrorist. But TSA is the only security agency in the world that considers it a terrorist warning sign if someone has excessive complaints about airport security.
And by the way, this hearing today about TSA also on C-SPAN radio, so you can tune in if you're in your car, but also if you have your cell phone or your mobile device. We have a radio app. You can listen to what the TSA administrator has to say there. Doug, Newport News, Virginia, independent caller. You're next.
Hello, it's a pleasure to talk with you this morning. I have a question about the budgetary concerns regarding the wars. Senator Bernie Sanders is proposing what people are miscalling a free college. He's actually proposing college reimbursement for state college tuition. Anybody that's ever gone to college understands that tuition is just a small part of going to college. You got room and board and books and living expenses also. Would the cost of the wars in Afghanistan be able to pay for people to go to college under his
I don't know the breakdown of the separate costs in Afghanistan. I'm also not exactly sure what Senator Sanders is proposing. It would certainly, it's fascinating to see the details in Afghanistan because we poured in hundreds of billions of dollars and it's financed corruption. For instance, in the top military hospital in Afghanistan, the Afghan equivalent of Walter Reed, there was so much corruption that wounded soldiers starved to death because they could not pay bribes to the hospital staff for food. Washington Post had a great story a couple weeks ago about how the Afghan army doesn't have boots because they're so corrupt in their contracting that the boots they get fall apart the first time soldiers wear them. I mean, we've simply fizzled this away, and we've made Afghan a more corrupt place because of it.
Paul is calling from Arizona, an independent caller. You're on the air.
Good morning. I would like James to maybe address the subject of terrorism didn't start in a vacuum. The creation of the hate of our way of life was due to our own actions. And now we're spending, like he says, $4 trillion here already, fighting something that is an idea and a reaction to our past policies.
Mr. Bovard.
That's an interesting point. That there are, if you look back at 9/11, Osama bin Laden said there were three primary reasons for it, one of which was U.S. troops being stationed in Muslim Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. Another one was the embargo on Iraq. Another one was the U.S. support of Israel. Especially in the troops in Saudi Arabia, it made no sense to have them there, to be stirring up all that hatred. And our other policies have also done that. But what we need is a supply-side anti-terrorism policy. Because at this point, the U.S. government is doing so many things that's creating new terrorists, and it's going to be the people that will hate us in the future and might want to kill us. For instance, Obama's drone policy. The president has been very secretive about how many people he's killed. And there have been a lot of civilians who have died in those attacks, and we don't know how many. And the Obama administration had some hokum about how, well, if it was a military-aged male, which means a male between, the age of 16 and 50 or 60, then we're going to assume that he was a terrorist suspect. Well, this is absurd, but this is how the government covers its butt. And we're seeing this forever in the war on terror. We're seeing the logic being twisted. We're seeing the secrecy, and the only consistent thing is the government always wins. So,
how did it come about that Transportation Security Administration, you put the price tag at $70 billion? I mean, how did you come to that figure, and how did it come about that TSA would get that much money, more than the FBI? In this war against terror? Well,
see, I mean, you have to keep in mind that right after 9/11, the Transportation Secretary promised that TSA would hire the best and the brightest, and that's why they've gotten all the money. Now, basically, I just added up their budget from 2002 onwards, and it's interesting. TSA's moaning and groaning about how it's struggling right now with budget cuts. TSA had more agents and I think a larger budget in 2007 when there were more travelers than what it has right now. These huge delays at TSA are largely because TSA is more intrusive. These whole body scanners are not worth a gallon of spoiled milk, and yet you have them slowing up the airports, and you also have TSA being much more aggressive. I was flying back from Portland on Thanksgiving, and I got to the airport early, and so I chose to opt out instead of going through the whole body scanners. And the TSA agent does your usual pat down, and he takes off his gloves. Then he takes it over to the explosive trace detector and goes, this shows a positive alert for explosives. I was out in Oregon. It wasn't like I was launching missiles or spending time with the shooting. I said, what explosive does it show? I don't know. It's a code. Well, how often do you get false alerts from this? That's classified. Okay. So he and two other agents take me to a private screening room where I get an enhanced pat down, where it's a lot more vigorous, a lot more aggressive, and it concludes with this TSA guy basically grinding his hand, his palm into my groin like he's trying to turn my family jewels into a pancake. And so I hammered the TSA on that in USA Today. I've filed a FOIA request and got the videotapes of when I was going through that checkpoint. And it has all the different segments, except when I'm taken behind closed doors, where they were very aggressive. And this is like a metaphor of the entire war on terror. Yeah, it seems bad, it seems stupid, and then they take you behind closed doors and it gets a whole lot worse. And yet, very few people on Capitol Hill have really turned up the heat on TSA. There have been some people, John Micah's hammered them at times.
Just on our show yesterday.
Yep. I mean, I wish he would twist would be more vigorous on that. But for instance, I think it was a congressman in South Carolina, Clyburn.
James Clyburn?
Yeah, James Clyburn said, well, he said one of the problems with TSA is that it doesn't treat congressmen specially, that it doesn't realize that congressmen need to be really, hey, this is a special class. I'd love to know how many of these congressmen effectively get a pass and don't get hassled by TSA, because if President Obama said that nobody would say that TSA was an example of how people are losing their freedoms. And tell that to the people in lines in Chicago and Atlanta, and tell that, I mean, there's a lot of women who have been horrendously abused in these enhanced pat-downs. It's a lot more of a trauma for a woman than for a guy, and it's unjustified. It's sheer harassment.
Salem, Oregon. Ron is next, a Republican there. You're on the air.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. What's really got us in this mess is our 8-year lame duck, and we really don't need Hillary to follow that up.
All right. That was Ron's opinion. We'll go to Sean, Providence, Rhode Island, a Democrat. Good morning.
Greetings. Certainly I appreciate C-SPAN, and can you hear me?
We can, Sean.
Anyway, James is a very bright guy with a very astute and a very broad knowledge of the circumstances. My question is, what would you replace it with? Because your description is very doomsday, and I appreciate it fully, because nobody could be more disappointed with our government and its non-functional status than me. But what would you replace it with? What kind of world, you're a philosopher type, what kind of world vision do you have that would be much more successful in terms of harmonizing the people on the face of the earth and enabling them to live somewhat peacefully? That's my question.
Yeah, thanks for the excellent question. I've written about free trade a lot over the last few decades. I did a book a while back called Fair Trade Fraud, Criticizing Protectionism. Free trade is one thing, but if we simply mind our own business, it's not a panacea. There will still be people who hate us, no matter if we don't bomb their country or overthrow their government or things like that. But that would be a great first step. And on the home front, I mean, privatize airport security would be a huge step. I mean, you had the IG report that leaked out last year, showed that the TSA failed 95% of the time to detect bombs and explosives. Okay, it didn't fail 100% of the time, but it almost cannot be worse. But a fundamental change between 9/11, and now is going to the airports now. You're dealing with federal agents. They have sovereign immunity. They can harass you. They can sexually assault you. They can steal your things. FBI, the TSA's fired more than 500 agents for stealing from passengers. And that's probably only the tip of the iceberg of the amount of theft that's been happening. They've had more than 70,000 people have complained to the TSA about theft or damaged luggage or property from the TSA. We need to put the government back on a leash, and that's the fundamental problem, because the government is out of control. It's been out of control since 9/11, when George W. Bush promised that he would rid the world of evil. And I was watching him on TV, and he said that, and I said, okay, now people are going to laugh. They haven't. Instead, people just said, oh, that's a great idea. Let's rid the world of evil. And the first thing that he does is unleash the government to rid the world of evil. But the founding fathers realized that the most basic step is put a leash on the politicians, because otherwise they will destroy our rights, our freedom, and our prosperity.
By the way, a tweet from Stephen who says, attention deficit democracy. That's a line I will reuse. Very apt. That's also the title of your book.
Yes, it's a book I wrote in 2006.
What do you focus on? Because you're writing in USA Today as well about corruption, and we can talk about that a little bit. But what do you focus on? Where is most of your research and your writing on?
Well, basically, I just try to think of topics that would help build faith in government.
Your sarcasm is coming through. So.
Okay, well, hey, I was hoping you did. The last time I was on I was on C-SPAN. The host asked me, well, what is your political orientation? I said, well, you know, I'm a moderate. And he says, you don't think so? You don't sound like one. No, I mean, I just try to, what I've done for decades is try to write about things that would help people understand how the government has far too much power. And it's not simply a Democrat or Republican thing. I've done books attacking Bill Clinton. I've done books attacking George W. Bush. But the politicians as a class have far too much power over the rest of us. And the government is profoundly dishonest. And the government is a deadly peril to our rights and liberties. And this is what Americans used to understand. But now there is this officer-friendly notion of government that we're supposed to presume that the government's going to be like a, some kind of guardian angel. And it doesn't matter what we do or where we go, the government will take care of us. But again, I just try to focus on the nuts and bolts of what the government does to help people recognize how much of their rights and liberties that they've lost, and also to make them laugh at times. Because laughing at the government is, it's a badge of freedom.
San Francisco, David, Independent. Good morning.
Yeah, morning. I agree and disagree with him. I suspect actually that Operation Gladio is behind 9/11 and this whole situation. But I'm interested in how he calculated the top secret budget. If basically the taxpayers are supposed to have taxation with representation, now it's against the law for the congressman to even know how the budgets are being spent, much less it's against the law for them to tell us how these budgets are being
and David, you're referring to the intelligence budgets.
Well, he's talking about a $4 trillion spending campaign, and how did
we'll take that point, David. I'm saying Jim Bovard. I mean, the intelligence budgets were not known, and it was secret, was not allowed to be public, and then in the past, 5 years or something, Congress said, okay,
Snowden. Snowden.
Yeah,
one word, Snowden.
We'll let you know what the top line is for the intelligence
budgets.
Right,
and this it's an excellent question from the caller. I appreciate that. This is a good example of how this cloak of secrecy has covered up so many things the government has done since 9/11. I think that they're saying the intelligence budget agencies are around 56, 55, 59
billion.
Yeah, billion. But if you just have a round number, it's sort of like going to a car dealer and you ask about a car. He says, well, that's 40,000. Well, what do I get for 40,000? I can't tell you. And this is what we have with so many of these federal agencies. And the NSA has basically screwed up massively before 9/11, and has the budget has greatly increased, of course. And it's an example, but a lot of these other intelligence agencies, we got no idea what the heck they're doing. I mean, it was wonderful that Snowden did what he did. I wish there were a dozen more. And there's other agencies like the State Department. The State Department has so much secret funding, effectively, that passes through the foreign aid. On foreign aid, we have very little idea how much of it is spent, because it just goes, it's, as the old saying goes, foreign aid is money from a government to a government for a government.
And that's what you're writing about today in USA Today?
Yeah, that's part of what I wrote about today, how the U.S. foreign aid is breeding corruption around the world at the same time that John Kerry is taking his public vow to fight corruption. It's a paradox.
When it comes to surveillance and Edward Snowden, you put the price tag at $500 billion in your story.
Yeah, I mean, that's the price for a lot of the surveillance stuff since 9/11. Not strictly limited to the war on terror. It's because again, it's not broken out, but there's a huge increase in that. And I was reading last night some of the other details I hadn't been aware of on this, and I think it was in 2011 the Obama administration was trying to set up a system where it could track everybody's cell phone movements, and it's like, they have a lot of time on their hands if they want to do that. And, you get a lot of false positives. But, because the budgets have been almost unlimited, they've been able to pull in all this money, and they just like to stockpile information on the rest of us. But, it's important to have a balance between the citizens and the government. And with the surveillance, people have become more afraid to criticize the government, and government has got a lot more trump cards to play against the citizens. And it makes a mockery of the self-government.
Back to calls. Jim in Grand Forks, North Dakota, Republican.
Hey, how you doing, James?
Good.
I agree and disagree. I voted for Bush, and I made a mistake. And to me, I kind of try to laugh too to keep from crying. And one of the things is I kind of pretend sometimes I'm in an Orwell novel because it seems like that we're told one thing and we deep down inside we remember the past. Like me and you, I'm 52. I remember, like I've called one time before, jumping on an airplane was very innocent and fun. And why was that, James? I think you probably know why. It was because we were a homogenous people. We were and one of the most beneficial things about homogeneity, racial homogeneity and religious homogeneity, is trust. The government knew us and we knew the government, and we weren't a perfect country. We had a lot of problems between black and white, but we did not have this mistrust, and of course the government does not trust us. That's what's going on here, and the government refuses to say who the enemy is, so we're all basically guilty. Now,
okay. Jim Bovard, do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. If you go to a place like Holland, you've got a wide variety of nationalities there, and yet the government isn't paranoid of everybody and treating them all like they're a terror suspect all the time. And it's interesting. There are places. It would be easy for the government to focus on real terrorist threats if they chose to do that. Instead, the government gets a lot more power by treating almost everybody as a threat. Now, I mean, he was saying that folks are somewhat homogenous. I mean, my experience with TSA often doesn't like me, and I've wondered if TSA has a secret profile for scruffy rednecks, or maybe ornery rednecks, or people that just kind of radiate kind of like, this is a bunch of crap. So, so anyhow.
Okay. Crofton, Maryland. Mike, independent caller.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for being on the program. This is really refreshing to hear. I wanted to ask you how much of a factor is rhetoric in all of this, like phrases such as war on terror, for example.
Okay, Mike, we'll take that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, the whole phrase war on terror, well, what is terror? Well, terror is bad things done by non-governments. But if it's government killing somebody, then it's not terrorism, it's public service. And it's almost that absurd. But if you look at some of the governments the U.S. supports, like Uzbekistan, which I guess a decade ago, used some of its U.S. aid to just slaughter hundreds of demonstrators, and which is known for taking dissidents and boiling them alive in vats of oil, but they still get U.S. foreign aid. If you look at Haiti, utterly corrupt. The U.S. gives money to governments that are horrendously persecuting their own people, but that's not terrorism. I mean, the sovereign immunity is a Pandora's box, and it's much more so with the war on terror, because the government can commit so many more atrocities. If you look at the court decisions on the torture cases from the Bush administration, you've got judge after judge basically saying, well, it would be unseemly to hold the government liable for torture, or to hold any individual like Ashcroft or Cheney or others liable for torture. And, you can't have a free society if some people have a license to torture other people.
Let's get to John before the House gavels in here in New Jersey, an independent caller. Hi, John.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN, and thanks for this terrific guest this morning. How about President Obama's selling about $100 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia in light of the 28 pages? And
I don't know what happened there. Sorry to you, but pick that up. Saudi Arabia selling weapons.
Yeah, thanks for the call. It's President Obama has worked really hard to cover Saudi Arabia's the cover for Saudi Arabia, and sold them a lot of weapons. Right now, the U.S. has been providing support for a Saudi war in Yemen. The Saudis have killed a large number of Yemen civilians. They're causing horrendous problems in that country. There is no good reason for the U.S. to be backing that. The Saudis have been perhaps the primary funders of the ISIS terrorist group and other extreme groups. There was a story, I think, in the New York Times a day or two ago about how the Saudis have helped bankroll extremist Muslim clerics in Kosovo and helping, encouraging people in Kosovo to go there to the Middle East for jihad. You know, there are a lot of good people in Saudi Arabia. I hope the government does better there, but it makes no sense for us to be kowtowing and covering for them.
At this hearing this morning with the TSA administrator, what are you going to be, what do you want to hear? I mean, what are you watching for from the administrator? TSA has been having hearings like this for going back more than a decade. I assume that he'll just kind of make vague promises that they'll fix things, and I fired this person, and now we're supposed to pretend it's all better. It's a bunch of hokum. It won't get better. We have to go. Thank you very much, Jim Bovard. You can find the piece on Reason.com. There it is in the recent edition of the magazine. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
And like we said, House will gavel in for their morning session here. We'll bring you up to the chamber. Live coverage here on